Very good morning to one and all for taking time to join us today at the 39th ASEAN Roundtable. It's entitled Surviving Multipolarity. This session for the morning is cheekily entitled Who Moved ASEAN's Cheese? And if you have read the self-help book, you know what I'm talking about. But despite the tongue-in-cheek title, I assure you that this is a serious panel that will attempt to unpack the very rapid and fast-moving changes that Southeast Asia has faced and is continuing to face in the last few years and the years to come. As you know, ASEAN's ambitious goal since the adoption of its ASEAN Charter in 2007 and the subsequent creation of its ASEAN communities was to realize an integrated region that is strong economically, politically, and socially. And the creation of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015 and all the subsequent blueprints, ASEAN Loves blueprints, were to serve as a roadmap to meeting this end goal of economic integration. Now, at the point of ASEAN's 50th birthday in 2017, everything looked well. It looked as if the region was on track to realizing a strong, prosperous, and secure region. But in 2018, the US-China trade war started under the Trump administration. Then in 2019, the world faced its worst global public health crisis that shut down trade, business, movement of people and goods. It took tremendous effort for this region to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and until today, besides the long-term COVID health effects that some of us may be suffering from, economies too are still suffering from long-term economic scarring, and vulnerable communities in our region continue to deal with widening social equality gaps. And I think the rest, as you know quite well, is more or less history already. In February 2021, the Myanmar coup took place. A year later, we had the Russia-Ukraine war. And then in October of last year, the Gaza conflict. I don't know about you, but every morning when I wake up, it's so stressful. You have to look at the news. What's happening? What's the breaking news for the morning? So we are facing a new normal in geopolitics, where not a week or a month goes by without some breaking developments. These very profound and rapid changes are threatening the stable environment that ASEAN has been operating in to attain its cheese. ASEAN's cheese is peace, stability, economic and social development. But the goalpost seems to be shifting all the time. So our panel will unpack what these changes are and how can ASEAN mitigate these challenges. Before we begin, let me introduce our three esteemed speakers. The first on my left is Ambassador Barry Desker. In Singapore, we like to describe people and posts using the language of digital mobile networks. For instance, we have a 4G cabinet. If I had to describe Ambassador Desker this way, he would be our 1G diplomat, one of the most excellent diplomats Singapore has had. Ambassador Desker is currently the Distinguished Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS, and in Nanyang, a Professor of Practice at NTU. Ambassador Desker is the founding dean of RSIS, in case you didn't know. He holds a number of very important positions as well, as a member of the Presidential Council for Minority Rights and a member of the Board of Directors of the LKY Exchange Fellowship. Ambassador Desker's knowledge of the region is unparalleled. He was Singapore's ambassador to Indonesia in 1986 to 1993, and then subsequently the CEO of the Singapore Trade Development Board. Back then, I think now it is ESG. And formerly also the chair of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights in 2018. Now, Ambassador Desker, if you also didn't know, launched his book last week called Reflections, Singapore's Place in the World. I missed the launch due to travels, but I flipped the book cover on Amazon.com, and I knew immediately that many of the topics we are all interested in and that Ambassador covered in the book will be salient discussion points for our session. Our second speaker is Dr. Marie Pangestu. Ibu Mari has just accepted a very important appointment as Indonesia's Special Envoy on Trade under President Prabowo Subianto's cabinet. So we are very grateful, Ibu Mari, that you've made time to come to the roundtable. Ibu Mari was formerly Indonesia's Minister of Trade, 2004 to 2011, Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy, 2011 to 2014, and the World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships from 2020 to 2023. So she has over 30 years of experience working in international trade, investment, and development in multilateral, regional, and national settings. She holds numerous academic and research posts. And I think I won't go into that because you can read it also in the detailed pack that we've given you. And she has also previously served in different capacities at important institutions like the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and she was chairperson of the Board of Trustees at the International Food Policy Research Institute in DC, commissioner for the Low Carbon Development Initiative of Indonesia, amongst others. And we're very honored to have her here despite her new responsibility. Last but not least, I have Mr. Ben Bland on my right. He's the director of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. Here at ISEAS, we are avid followers of the Chatham House's policy outputs. We constantly read out on what you have to offer us. So it's really wonderful to have Ben here in person. His research focuses on the nexus of politics, economics, and international relations in Southeast Asia, as well as China's role in the broader region and the contours of the US-China strategic competition. And if you didn't know, he was formerly the director of Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. He is the author of 2 critically acclaimed books on Asian politics, Men of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia, so another Indonesian expert, and Generation HK, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. So with that, I will move to our very first speaker, and that's Ambassador Barry Desker, and then Ibu Mari, and Ben. The speakers, yes.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning. When I looked at the CVs of the participants at today's function, I felt like a museum piece. I happen to be the Singapore Sherpa in the drafting of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And I was also one of the Singapore Sherpas in the drafting of the Bali Declaration at the first ASEAN Summit. So you know how old it makes me feel. I shall focus on 3 issues this morning. First, the changing demographic landscape in ASEAN. Secondly, the digital economy and sustainability as emerging drivers of economic growth, and thirdly, ASEAN's trade and investment outlook. On the changing demographic landscape in ASEAN, one thing we need to bear in mind is that around 60% of ASEAN's total population is under the age of 35. Since the turn of the century, ASEAN's youthful population has been a critical factor in our economic resilience. This has set us aside from aging economies like Japan, with a median age of 46.4 years, and Europe with 44.4 years. This has benefited ASEAN. However, over the past 2 decades, ASEAN has experienced a demographic shift towards an aging population. In 2000, youth under 19 years made up 40.8% of the population. But in 2022, youth only accounted for 32.5%. The elderly population, age over 65 years, has increased from 5.3% to 7.5%, surpassing the UN's definition of an aging society. This will pose for our governments unfamiliar challenges for healthcare and social security systems. By 2030, 50% of ASEAN's population will join the ranks of the middle class, with strong implications for consumer spending, energy demand, and economic transformation. More than half already live in urban areas. There will be increasing urbanization, and this will highlight the unequal development between urban and rural areas, drawing attention to the pollution and environmental damage faced by congested cities. This urbanization trend will be marked by a shift from an agrarian economy towards an industry-based economy and increasingly to a services economy. But not all in ASEAN will have similar projections in terms of population. Countries like Indonesia and the Philippines will benefit from a growing working age population and an expanding population, boosting productivity, economic growth, and offering a demographic dividend. Thailand and Vietnam, like Singapore on the other hand, will face challenges arising from aging populations and low fertility rates. More than 26% of Thailand's population will be over 65 by 2040. And for Singapore, it will be almost 30%. This demographic divide within ASEAN will significantly impact the future regional economic landscape, requiring strategic policy adjustments. In particular, Thailand's aging population and Vietnam's declining fertility rates emphasize the need for domestic reforms in labor policies, healthcare, and social safety nets. My second area of focus will be the digital economy and sustainability as the emerging drivers of economic growth. The first emerging driver of economic growth is the digital economy. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the regional trend of digitalization and technology adoption. Internet users increased from 51 per 100 persons in 2017 to 72 per 100 persons in 2022, or over 480 million users. The highest percentage of internet users are from Brunei Darussalam, Malaysia, and Singapore, and the lowest is from Myanmar. ASEAN is also, by 2022, the home to 4,000 startups and 52 unicorns, startups with a valuation of at least US $1 billion. ASEAN's digital economy is expected to exceed $1 trillion by 2030, driven by growth in e-commerce, fintech, AI, and startups. Projections show that this could increase to $2 trillion with the implementation of DEFA, the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement. However, DEFA faces important problems in getting domestic buy-in, passing legally binding laws, ensuring intellectual property rights, alleviating the lack of trust by the public in governments and institutions, as well as the lack of institutions to monitor compliance. These are major challenges facing ASEAN bureaucracies who push for more regionally integrated economies. At the national level, countries like Indonesia and Vietnam are experiencing rapid growth in e-commerce and startups, driving digital transformation in the two countries. Even countries like Cambodia and Laos are becoming more familiar with digital payments, ride-hailing, and startups. Industries are being reshaped by AI and automation. This drives both opportunities and challenges. Automation is reorganizing supply chains and production processes with a higher demand for skilled labor. AI is fueling growth, but at the same time, we must recognize that most of the region is at an early stage in terms of AI adoption. Currently, ASEAN is seeing greater cross-border digital connectivity and data-driven services, bringing about a deeper change than previous technological advances. Let me now turn to what I see as a second driver of economic growth, a sustainable economy. Unlike technological change in previous eras, there is now a focus on sustainability. Governments are looking for solutions that can match the urgency and scale of the climate crisis. Digital technologies could be a critical tool in this effort. Greening the growth presents another major sustainable development opportunity, aligning economic growth with global decarbonization efforts. The region has vast potential in renewable energy, including solar, wind, and hydropower, which could reduce reliance on fossil fuels and enhance energy security. This need to upscale current efforts over the next 5 to 10 years is important because it will help to prevent us from getting locked into unsustainable paths. At my book launch last week, one of those who attended was Indonesia's coal king. And what was interesting was that in our conversation, he highlighted that his own focus now is on green energy. The transition to a green economy is expected to create 30 million new jobs in ASEAN by 2050. And there is a $3 million investment opportunity in climate resilient infrastructure for ASEAN, according to the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. The likely focus will be on renewable energy, green buildings, electric vehicles, sustainable agriculture, and lower carbon, positioning the region to balance sustainability with the need for economic growth. If I can turn now to my third point, ASEAN's trade and investment outlook, we remain a key player in global trade. According to the WTO, we account for 7.9% of global exports in 2022, with intra-ASEAN trade comprising 22.3% of the total. Global economic power is moving from the US, which is experiencing economic challenges, to China, despite China's own slowing growth and rising debt. But we should not discount the United States and the West, which have demonstrated a capacity to adapt and to absorb diverse migrant populations. At the same time, trade in the East Asian Summit countries, standing at US dollars $19.9 trillion in 2023, accounts for half of worldwide trade. The EAS partners account for most of the FDI to ASEAN, and ASEAN does remain an attractive area for FDI. By 2030, ASEAN is projected to attract over 100 billion in digital-related investments, solidifying its position within global digital supply chains. There is also, within the region, an increasing trend of servicification of manufacturing firms, where these firms are producing and exporting both goods and services concurrently. This has helped to improve the productivity and export performance of manufacturing firms. Services supply chains are also becoming a crucial driver of trade and growth in the ASEAN region, reflected by the robust growth in ASEAN services trade, with services exports rising from $113 billion in 2005 to US $445 billion in 2022. Finally, in the future, ASEAN's decisive shift towards sustainability and digitalization will further, in my view, enhance its position as a preferred destination for global capital. This transformation will drive economic growth, improve livelihoods and prosperity, and ensure a more sustainable future. The challenge to this positive scenario arises from the threat of domestic instability, growing competition among the major powers, and pressures which could lead to bigger thy neighbor practices and de-risking strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Desker, for giving us a very good overview of where ASEAN is and where ASEAN might move to. And I give the floor to our next speaker, Ibu Mari Pangestu.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today with old friends, many old friends. I knew Ambassador Desker when I first came back to Indonesia as a young economist. And I don't know whether you remember this, when I became trade minister, I asked you for some advice how I should set up my negotiating team, because you were then the head of the Trade Development Board. And of course, my old friend, Soksapana, we've done many things together. So I'm very glad to be here. And it is kind of a good time and a sad time. A sad time in the sense that the challenges we have ahead of us and the complexities of the issues that we face. I've attended many sessions, similar sessions, and it's always like fancy titles like evolution or revolution, or this, like what I put here, new global economic order or disorder, and how do we manage all this? I don't have the answers, but I will just share with you a few thoughts, at least from my perspective and maybe my experience. Now, how do I move this? How do I move the cheese? How do I move the slides? This one? Pressing where? Over there? Not working. Ah, okay. You have to, oh, this was blocking it. See, we have to deblock many things. Okay, I'm going to talk about four things, but the main part of my presentation, what I want to share with you is actually the last part. But the first three parts is just the setting, because I do think we need to have a good idea about what are we facing before we talk about what we need to do. So first setting. This is something when I was 3 years in the World Bank during the COVID time. This was really driven home, how the COVID really, I mean, you the moderator, you mentioned that the scarring effect and so on. Unfortunately, how many years are we now? 2 years, 3 years later, yes, we have recovered. Yes, we have stabilized, but it's still slow growth, basically. And we are below the projected trajectory pre-COVID, and we are facing higher uncertainty. Whether it's the conflict, whether it's climate, whether it's the geopolitics and the defragmentation. But within that, you have diversification opportunities and relocation opportunities, especially this region has been benefiting from that. And as Ambassador Desker really illustrated, there are new sources of growth, whether it's the green transition or digital related growth. I think your point about servicification, that's the hardest word to pronounce. Servicification of global supply chains is very important. I have been fighting to get services into the trade agenda for forever, and I think this time we have to get that right. So that's one setting. I think the IMF actually, in the most recent World Economic Outlook, called it global growth is stable but underwhelming, and it will lead to inequalities between countries as well as within countries. Next is, of course, we have to start here. One of those big issues is the defragmentation and the US-China trade war. And because it has already, you have since 2018, you have data to see what happened. And basically, the summary of it is that the decoupling that everybody's afraid was so fearful of only happened really with the products that had high tariffs, 25% and above, and now some of them are 100%. But in the short term, depending the outcome of the U.S. elections, if there's going to be continued increase in tariffs and tit for tat, the GDP growth in the near future is going to fall by 0.5% in an already slow growth situation. And I was told that the G20, this is one of the big topics for the G20 finance ministers. So finance ministers, whether they like it or not, they have to face this issue. And the IMF estimated if you actually had total decoupling or defragmentation, it would cost the world 7% of GDP. But there are opportunities. As we know, there was diversification and relocation to third countries. So China exports to the US went down, and US exports to China went down, but on these products, but it went to third countries. Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, main beneficiaries, but the other Southeast Asian countries as well. But if you look at the data very carefully, what happened is that you have a lengthening of the supply chain because most of the components are coming from China. And then we have the critical minerals issue, which is part of one of the areas which is sensitive for security concerns. And here, Indonesia, if you talk about the region, we have a lot of the minerals. Indonesia and Philippines has nickel. Malaysia has rare earths. Myanmar actually has a lot of cobalt, and Australia has lithium. So it gives you the kind of sense of opportunity for the supply chain of one of the big areas of green transition, which is the critical minerals, the batteries, and the EV. So there's a lot of relocation in semiconductor and EV coming to Southeast Asia to bypass the high wall and the small garden. But this is the big challenge for Southeast Asia. We need to decide whether we want to do it like in the old days. I was, I guess, old enough to experience the competition between the ASEAN countries for the national car. combustible engine. I think we are seeing a similar competition now for EV. Every country wants to have the EV being made in their country rather than looking at it as a regional supply chain, because that's the way to go. And then see how you can develop your investment climate, ecosystem, and human capital versus what is kind of happening, increase in the use of industrial policy. That's another big challenge we have. There are other greater uncertainties and challenges: conflict and wars, climate, other shocks, technology, and social tensions. Just on climate, I just want to emphasize, because for the trade-related part, related to the fact that we are facing increased use of, by countries, especially EU, using climate mitigation that is cross-border, CBAM and all this. And this will have obviously an impact for us. And the fact that to be competitive today, you have to have a sustainable supply chain, and you need renewable energy for that. So it's related to the first issue about having renewable energy. And this is where the ASEAN, I think the ASEAN grid, energy grid, this is like 30 years ago, we talked about this. Some of this is starting to happen, but this is really an urgent priority for ASEAN, in my view. Okay, let me close in the last, let's see, I'm just timing myself, 7 minutes to come to the crux of trying to find an answer. How does ASEAN face this challenging world? Let me just self-confess my bias. I have been and I continue to be a believer in multilateralism and open regionalism. And I think that's still the way to go. But we, of course, need to adjust and adapt to the whole changing world and the fact that we now have economics, security, and technology nexus. We are seeing global economic disorder and so on. We see rise in unilateral measures, dispute settlement not functioning. Everything that we try to, have dispute on goes to the void, as they say, because the appellate body is not functioning. And the use of security to define or have exceptions for using trade restrictions. So the notion of resilient supply chain is still trying to have a definition. And this is where we need to come in and make sure we understand and do it in our region. And of course, the rise in the trade and climate nexus. So you've got resilient supply chain and sustainable supply chain, besides having to be competitive in other ways. I think Soksapana, you mentioned this. Others have mentioned it. You got to take as given this U.S.-China issue is not going to go away. Whoever wins the election, it's bipartisan. So how to navigate, not choose sides. We should not be forced to take sides. I think we've all been saying this. We need to continue to engage. But the big issue for us as ASEAN and East Asia more widely, because we have the convening power with the dialogue partners, as well as through RCEP and other mechanisms, EAS, as Rebecca mentioned, how and who fills the vacuum of leadership in multilateralism and global economic order. If the US is not going to be there, there's no strong leadership anymore, because the cost of implosion of the global economic order, as I gave you some numbers, the cost is very high to our growth. And it's going to be important to make sure that trade and investment continues to grow for our growth and for our development. So the role of ASEAN is really important in being the agent or playing the agency role to ensure as much as possible you can maintain the rules-based trading system and lead by example. So let me close by my constructive incrementalism approach. Some people call it, we had different names for it. Variable geometry. In APEC, they use pathways, different pathways, or multi-pronged strategy. I use constructive incrementalism because you kind of have to do everything all at once, and you've got to be practical about it while keeping that bias that I started out with, multilateralism and open regionalism, in mind. I give you just a flavor of it. It would take too long for me to go through everything that that is possible to talk about in this conversation. Let me start with the most difficult one, which is what we're trying to navigate: economic security and technology nexus. How do we avoid decoupling? How do we avoid being caught in the G2 bifurcation? I'm going to quote Shiro Armstrong here, who's been doing a lot of writing and thinking about this. It's not on the slide, but I thought the best way to summarize it is that we have to do two things. We have to work on keeping the garden small. So keep it to those so-called risky sectors, keep it small, and there's a high wall they're erecting. Hopefully it doesn't get too high. That's about the only thing you can do. How do you contain that? I have some ideas about that. But really what matters for us as ASEAN and East Asia is growing the rest of the garden, because that is really what's going to be important for us. That's the best way I can describe it. And I think Shiro at breakfast this morning described it in that way. So I thought that was a good way to summarize it. So how do we deal with the security? We can't take the US to dispute settlement anymore and say, you are misusing the security exception because the dispute settlement is going into the void. So, but we still should push in the WTO discussions and reform. How do we make sure dispute settlement can be working again, and challenge the use of the natural security exception, which is trying to what they call codify or put principles or even transparency into the use of Article 21. This is a bit jargonish, but it just basically means, can you actually, right now, if you want to say, I restrict this on national security grounds, it's self-declared. Nobody questions you on that. Now, how do you get to some kind of discipline around it? Second thing you can do is join what's happening outside of the WTO, which is the MPIA. It's 57 members, including EU. China is in there, Japan is in there, Singapore is there, and Australia is there, and Canada is there. So you can see, and that's a subgroup of the RCEP, of the East Asia, of the EAS. They are using exactly the same process of the WTO, but it only applies to the 57 members. Let's have more ASEAN members join. What do we do regionally? Let's manage the garden and the wall, but we need, most importantly, to grow the garden. How can we do that? We can, I think my basic argument here is that we need to strengthen our regional economic integration through our ASEAN and RCEP mechanisms. And there's a whole list of issues: reducing non-tariff measures, increasing connectivity, etc., etc. There's a whole list of things that we need to deploy and make sure it happens, and develop regional supply chains for these critical areas like semiconductor, like EV, like the green transition, and really implement RCEP. RCEP just started. We need to really see how RCEP can work. I'm not going to get technical on you, but if you're in the business sector, at the moment, RCEP is not very much utilized. The main users are China, Korea, and Japan, just because they don't have FTAs with each other. But for the rest, very low utilization. The main issue is cumulative rules of origin. That may sound very jargonish, but let me try to describe to you in a very simple way. Right now, what's happening is I can get rules of origin to get zero or low tariff from Indonesia or from ASEAN to China, but I can't get the rest. Say it's being manufactured, part of it in Korea and in Japan, and it gets combined with China and then comes here. I cannot cumulate that. I can only count the bilateral ASEAN +1 FTAs. That was not the intention of RCEP, right? Rebecca, you were there from the negotiations. It's supposed to be the bigger regional supply chain, and that needs to happen if you really want to have a regional supply chain. Business sector here maybe have other opinions. And most importantly, we have CPTPP. Because I mentioned this because it's no longer just Singapore and Vietnam as members. Indonesia, a month ago, announced its intention to join, as well as Philippines and Thailand. And this is open regionalism and building blocks. That's the other bias of us trade people. Use different, whatever you have, as building blocks. And so CPTPP and RCEP, maybe they don't merge, but they can sort of develop on each other. Where CPTPP is more advanced, we can take that into account when we update or upgrade the RCP. CPTPP doesn't really have a good capacity building and eco-tech section. Maybe they can learn from ASEAN, and so on. And finally, I don't have time to go into detail, but ASEAN should lead the way by strengthening the way ASEAN approaches things. That nexus between economics, technology, and security, we need, as Soksapana said, we need to reboot ASEAN. Can't just be siloed, security, economics, socio-culture. Even the communities need to be integrated. We don't want to be defragmented, and we want to have an integrated security approach, and not just military security, but non-traditional security like climate, health, and so on. And by the way, they are integrated. Economic prosperity, if your pillars are prosperity, peace, and resilience, they are related. If you have prosperity, you're going to have security and you're going to have resilience. So if you focus, let's focus on trade and prosperity. Let's make sure we strengthen economic integration and show the way by practicing open regionalism and maintaining the rules of trade and investment and leading the way. Let me close there because I've run out of time, but I'll be happy to pick up any details in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ibu Mari. That was really very comprehensive. I think we have a lot to unpack later in our Q&A. And now to Ben.
Thanks so much. When I was looking at the title for this session, Who Moved My Cheese, I suddenly started thinking of, I was in Indonesia, I started thinking of an Indonesian dish, pisang goreng, with keju and chocolate, so fried banana with cheese and chocolate. I mean, there isn't much cheese in the Southeast Asian diet traditionally, but that's one interesting dish which brings European cheese, chocolate from Latin America, Southeast Asian banana, throws it all together with, you've got your fat in there, your acid, your sugar, and that's kind of how Southeast Asia has benefited in the last few decades from bringing together, streams of ideas and engagement with different countries, companies from all over the world in the last few decades, and really profited from that. But sadly, we're moving away from that era, and I think that's what I want to talk about today, more on the challenges side. I mean, my very sort of distinguished colleagues, have the experience in government to set out some of the solutions. I'm going to play the sort of court jester role, just highlighting some of the problems. And I've spent most of my adult life living or working in or on Southeast Asia. A couple of years ago, I moved back to the UK, where I'm originally from. And it struck me in thinking what to say today, that a lot of the challenges facing Southeast Asia and ASEAN as an institution are very similar to the challenges facing my country, the United Kingdom, right now. So I'm going to talk today about this fragmentation question, tough choices, and trade-offs. Because I think it's very easy to say we don't want to make choices, we don't want to choose a side, but you're going to have to, whether you like it or not. And I think Soksapana already referred to that. It's not necessarily going to be a choice to ally with the US or ally with China or ally with Russia, but the decisions about who mines the minerals in your country, who you allow to sell their EVs, this goes for every country in the world, that's going to be met with a counter-response by others. And that's not just the case for the US and China, that's the case in technology and lots of other things that I'll talk about. So this is going to be a time of tough choices, and that requires trade-offs, and I think we all need to be more honest with ourselves, with our publics, about those trade-offs, because I love open regionalism and multilateralism, but our publics don't seem to like those ideas very much at the moment, and if we're not honest with them, we're going to have more negative counteractions. So the three big challenges I see, the first one I would say is actually the rise of China. I deliberately won't say US-China competition, because I think US-China competition is downstream of the rise of China, and it's one manifestation of the rise of China, but US-China competition for Southeast Asia and for Europe isn't the problem. Because if you imagine a President Trump, perhaps, in a few weeks, having a summit with President Xi Jinping and General Secretary Xi Jinping and agreeing to some sort of, spheres of influence in the world, I don't think that's going to stop the Philippines' problems in the South China Sea. I don't think that's going to stop the problems for Europe thinking about what to do about Chinese EVs. So we've got to think beyond just US-China competition. That's one manifestation of what we're seeing as more assertive, ambitious China with a growing economy, albeit one that's slowing, as Ambassador Deska said, and with more problems. But the sheer scale of China's economic power means that even when it's growing at a lower rate, it's still going to have a transformative effect around the world, and particularly, obviously, in China's near neighborhood. I think China's also showing more and more ambition in the way it engages in the world. I always think of Xi Jinping as something of a cautious leader. He tends to probe for weakness, and if he meets weakness, keeps pushing. If he meets resistance, thinks again. But you can see China being more ambitious, taking on more risk. We see that through these different initiatives. China's now pushing the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, the expansion of BRICS, the active role China took in negotiating between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the way it's taken quite an active role in negotiating between different Palestinian factions in Beijing since the war in Gaza kicked off a year ago. So we see China taking on more financial risk in terms of its global role, more political risk, and obviously we see US responding to that, and we see this cycle of escalation. People talk about de-risking, but what we're actually seeing is decoupling. But it's not complete decoupling, it's selective decoupling. And I think part of the story is in the trade numbers, which Ibn Mari pointed out, but it's also societal. We can see fewer and fewer US and European students going to China, fewer Chinese students and tourists going, a feeling of fear for ethnic Chinese people in some parts of the US and Europe about their ability to work in science and technology. So it's not just about the numbers. There's something deeper going on, which is quite concerning. And China's been pushing this from its side as well. Coupled with that is the breakdown of the rules-based order, which has already been spoken about. I won't go into too much detail there, but I think it's clear we're moving to what I would think of as an ad hoc, a la carte world. Both parts of that important. So a la carte, every country, every government is picking and chooses the rules, the norms it wants to follow, the institutions, the initiatives it wants to sign up to. But these are also very ad hoc, so they don't have very hard-baked rules. The UK, of course, is joining the CPTPP. As far as I know, there's no enforcement mechanisms in the CPTPP, so it's not a bad response to a world in which there's no global trade round. But it's very hard to enforce rules in these new kinds of institutions. And what's really fascinating to me is a mirroring between the US, where Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, has talked about the US pursuing a lattice work of these informal multilaterals, and what China's doing. Because if you think about the different initiatives I mentioned, the GDI, the GSI, the GCI, if you think about the BRICS and some of the other things China's doing, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's no hard and fast rules there. Countries can join, countries can leave. So there's a kind of flexibility there, there's a creativity, but there's also not much depth there. So it'll be interesting to see how that bears out in the next few years. But I think what we won't be relying on is rules and norms in the way we did in the past. And I think the third major kind of linked challenge is what I think of as the three main emerging socio-economic challenges, which is technology, climate change, and social inequality. I mean, none of them are new, but I think the pace at which they're expanding, the urgency and scale, I think was the framing that Ambassador Deska used, I think is something new. And these are things that are going to cause fragmentation, both between countries and within countries. With technology, we've already seen it with social media, but I think we're going to see that on steroids with AI. We're already starting to see it. And governments just aren't going to be able to respond to this, if we're honest. We're definitely not going to have a global response to AI, but even within governments, I don't think you're going to be able to throw up sovereign borders around AI. So we're going to see more and more fragmentation there. On climate change, it's clear the impacts hit really unevenly between countries, within countries, and also the solutions, talking about the green economy again, it's going to be very uneven. And I think social inequality obviously linked in a way to technology and climate change. We've seen in lots of countries around the world the destructive effects that can have on our society. Specifically then, how these things impact ASEAN, very briefly, I mean, one sort of ironic point is that while economic globalization is slowing, the globalization of these problems is accelerating. So we're in a world where we're losing the kind of upside spillover effects of globalization, but we have more and more globalized problems. And that's obviously true for technology and climate change. But even think about things like the North Korea-Russia partnership. Traditionally there was a sense maybe in Southeast Asia and in India as well that Europe had Europe's problems and you should deal with them, and Asia will deal with Asia's own problems. But once we can see North Korean troops, potentially fighting on the ground in Ukraine, we know that Kim Jong-un is going to be expecting something back from Vladimir Putin and Russia in return. We can see it's a very vivid example of the interlinkages in our world, and problems that we think might be confined to one part of the world actually can spill over to different geographies, different areas. Secondly, I think it's clear that these global issues are impacting intra-regional tensions within Southeast Asia. It was interesting in the ASEAN chairman's statement, which I know is not the most interesting thing, but it's what we have on the outside. The kind of global problems, geopolitical problems, are left to the end of the 44-page most recent statement. And of the problems that were listed there was South China Sea, Korean Peninsula, Myanmar, Ukraine, Middle East. Taiwan wasn't mentioned, but obviously that's another one. And if you think about things like South China Sea, Myanmar, Ukraine, Middle East, you see divisions within Southeast Asia, between Southeast Asian countries, on how to respond to these problems, what they mean. We see that the Philippines on the South China Sea is really a total outlier in its sort of assertive stance defending its sovereignty right now. We know that obviously, given the different diverse religious mixes in Southeast Asia, the Middle East crisis impacts very differently in domestic politics in Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore compared to, say, Vietnam. And we see on a question like Ukraine, Singapore has taken sanctions against Russia and no other Southeast Asian country has. And I think the last point, which I think Rebecca alluded to, was this question of a loss of relevance, or perhaps you might say a loss of some of the convening and normative power that ASEAN has joined in the past. It was really noticeable in the outside world. There's far more attention on the Quad summits these days, on the BRICS summits, than on the East Asia summit. And I think it is true that, for the US and for some of the Quad partners and for China, they do see these kind of institutions they're building as rivals to ASEAN. I mean, that's not the main purpose, but they want to be the convening power when decisions are made about Asia's security, Asia's technology, Asia's economy. So I think we are going to see this potential loss of relevance, a potential loss of ability to set norms, unless there's a response. So just to end, what can we do about this in the world? And I think this is a challenge for the UK and other middle powers and smaller countries, not just for Southeast Asia. So I think tough choices sounds bad because there will be tough things to be done, but choices obviously lets us know that we have options. And I don't think we live in a kind of Paul Kennedy world where great powers, sit at the map and divide things up. And, talking at conferences like this often makes us feel that way. But history shows that time and again, smaller states, middle states, non-state actors, companies have agency and can shape the way that bigger powers behave. I think that we see that time and again, but that requires us to embrace those choices, not just to wish them away. In his inauguration speech a week ago, Prabowo Subianto, new president of Indonesia, said, we can't just be ostriches with our heads buried in the sand. And I think that's right. So while I think it's good to try and avoid bifurcation in the world, it's good to promote open regionalism, I think that's going to be really, really hard to do. And I think we have to be honest among ourselves, but also for the democracies as well, honest with our own voters about the tough choices. Because if governments aren't honest with people about that, they're not going to be able to deliver. And if we have that kind of frustration with our politics, actually that's going to be the bigger challenge we're facing as the world crumbles, our own confidence on our own domestic systems will. And on that happy note, I will end it there.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that someone else, besides the people in the ASEAN Studies Centre, reads the ASEAN statements, all 44 pages of it. But you are right, because in the last few years, that's what we've been noticing as well, in the way that the statements have been crafted to show that, to show the tensions in the consensus decision-making processes, right? Where you say some states say this, others say that. It sort of presents a kind of unified outlook, but in a way you can still see the fault lines in that. So I think we've had three very excellent speakers and presenting jam-packed full of things and perspectives and information for us to dwell on. And I'd like to invite questions from the floor. So if anyone has questions, you can move to one of the three microphones, state your name and your affiliation, and ask those questions. I see a hand there. It's Karen. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you so much, all panelists, for your excellent presentation and insights. I have two quick questions. So one is just a follow-up point on Ibu Mary argument about the use of Article 21 of WTO agreement, national security exception, right? And you say that there's no, because WTO doesn't have DSM functioning, so it may be difficult to go after the members that may be abusing that exception. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on my follow-up point, which I think there's another way that we can raise this issue at WTO. We can raise it at WTO Trade Policy Review Committee, which does a periodical assessment of WTO members' conduct of their national trade policy. And for example, for the 4 biggest economy, this committee does the assessment every 3 years. For the next 16 biggest economy, this committee does assessment in every 5 years. So I just want to hear your thought on that, whether we can raise this the abuse of national security exception at the WTO Trade Policy Review Committee. And also, please allow me to ask the second question, which I think is very important, if not vital, to how we're going to drive ASEAN cooperation going forward. We haven't talked much about the sense of community that actually is a key driver of how ASEAN will integrate further. And I'd like to know your thoughts on what does ASEAN common identity means to you in a concrete way? Are we gonna use ASEAN anthem as one of them, or visa-free travel, or etc.? I just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
I see Pak Lewa. I'll collect a few questions and then we will take them at one go. Over to you.
Yes, I'm Lewa from Channel News Asia. 2 things that caught my attention. So Ibu Mary talked about we need to reboot ASEAN. And after that, since Prabowo was mentioned, so I need to ask about him too. So what do you think about Prabowo? Because not what you think about what he, let me rephrase that. The previous president was not known to have so much interest in ASEAN. I'm quoting my diplomat friends. So any thoughts about Prabowo? Because I also heard from my diplomatic sources that he wants Indonesia to once again become the tiger of ASEAN. And then the second question, because it is related to peace, stability, economic and social developments mentioned in the theme of the first session, is Myanmar still blocking East Timor's bid to join ASEAN? Thanks.
I will let Ibu Mari take the question on the raising the issue of the abuse of national security exceptions, and then on the sense of community, as well as views on the Prabowo leadership in ASEAN. Maybe all the speakers can give your views. And on Myanmar still blocking the bid of Timor-Leste, maybe I'll just address that. As far as we know, there's progress already in Timor-Leste joining ASEAN in terms of meeting the obligations of the roadmap. So all 10 ASEAN countries have come up with a roadmap for ASEAN for Timor-Leste to fulfill in its bid for membership, and we've heard from the ground that there's been substantial progress made. So I don't hear of any political objections coming from any member state blocking Timor-Leste. Okay, so with that, Ibu Mari first on WTO, and then the next 2 questions.
Well, I wasn't expecting such a technical question, but I'm happy to hear it, because we always feel like nobody really cares about WTO anymore. So I'm very grateful for the question. I actually agree with you. Yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to explain, but when I talk about let's deal with the what can we do about Article 21, which is the exception, using the national security as exception to using trade restrictions that are actually not allowed under the WTO. I said, okay, first high call is codification, that if you could actually get the norms and disciplines in place, but that would require you, of course, to negotiate. Second high call would be at least have a dialogue and a discussion. What are the principles? You have tried to come up with some guardrails. And that can actually happen not just in the WTO, but it can happen in APEC, for instance. APEC is used to dealing with kind of sensitive issues because you're not negotiating. I'm old enough to have participated in the early 90s in the APEC, where we were talking about the non-binding investment principles, something like national treatment we take for granted. At that time, there was a lot of resistance to national treatment. It took me 20 years later before I could implement it in Indonesia, but it was there, right? So I'm just trying to illustrate that APEC, I'm also quite sad that nobody really mentioned APEC, but APEC can still play a role. And as I suggested, maybe RCEP could also, or even CPTPP, could actually have a codification of a national security exception clause. The final one is your suggestion, actually, transparency, right? Which could go through the trade policy review mechanism, but for developed countries, I think it's like every 4 years, is it? Or it's quite a long period, right? So actually Bernard Hoekman, those of you who know Bernard Hoekman, he's like one of our best trade specialists. He suggested a similar idea, but not in the trade policy, not just through trade policy review mechanism, but any time a country wants to use that exception, they need to just have a session with other countries to explain, I'm using this because of what, right? Just to explain. It's part of the transparency. And I think that's the minimum we can hope for. And even then, I'm not even sure it would be accepted. On the sense of community, I think it's gonna have to go beyond just anthems. I think travel and not just travel for tourism, but for work. Yeah, making it easier for intra-ASEAN work. Yeah, in all levels, and I also think, going back to my idea about regional supply chain, starting with ASEAN and wider, because I do think what we achieved with ASEAN Free Trade Area did help to feel, at least from businesses, they don't just look at Indonesia, they look at ASEAN. When they're thinking about how they're going to be expanding their business, they do that. So it's already become something that's very natural. And so now, with the more expanded horizon of new sectors and so on and challenges, I actually think that would also be another way for a common identity to emerge. There is an old idea, is it same time zone? That was an old idea that kept on coming back. I don't know whether that's another idea for common identity, but just to throw that in. Thank you.
Ambassador Deska, any thoughts? And in particular, because you mentioned about the youth population in Southeast Asia, how does that impact the sense of community?
Well, thank you, Sharon. But before I go into the other issues, since I was the Singapore senior officials who was involved in WTO negotiations for 7 years, and I was part of the Invisibles group, a group of 15, 16 leaders of delegations, which nobody talked about at that time. And what happened is we reached the agreements and then sold it out to our individual groupings and those outside the groupings. But if I look back, this was the essential mistake of the WTO, because the aim was to reach agreements among the negotiators. What we never sought was to bring those concepts out to the larger community so that there was no buyback within our own societies, within the societies that we were trying to persuade. And essentially, when you look at the opposition to the WTO, it is because there was pushback to the agreements which people felt had been reached by their governments without their consent. And I think this was the original sin of the WTO. So if I can turn to the other issues which were raised, the question of Indonesian foreign policy under Prabowo. I would agree that Indonesia is likely to play a much more significant role in international affairs under Prabowo leadership. President Jokowi's focus was on domestic change, domestic reform. The foreign minister was given quite a free hand. But I think in the next 5 years, you will see that President Prabowo will play a much more active role in both the making of foreign policy and the making of defense policy. And I say this as someone who spent 11 years in Indonesia, including 7 years as Singapore's ambassador from 86 to 93. The third question I'd like to address is Myanmar. I should make a caveat. In 2007, I called for the suspension of Myanmar from ASEAN. And I've held to the view that we should have suspended Myanmar then, and that we lost a major opportunity in drafting the ASEAN Charter. What happened was the Eminent Persons Group, composed of some of the best minds in ASEAN, people like Ali Alatas, Jah Kumar in Singapore, I mean, Anand in Thailand, you name them, they were part of that group. They came up with a recommendation of including a provision for the suspension of members. Unfortunately, when this was reviewed by ASEAN bureaucrats, the agreement was watered down. My view, and in this I engage in a public debate which is on the record in the Straits Times with Tommy Koh, who chaired the review committee, because the review committee reduced the conditionalities which were imposed. And consequently, we are now living with the consequences. Thank you.
That's very, very exciting to hear. So right now, ASEAN is left with a marriage that no one can get out of. I'm so sorry to hear. I wish that it could have been taken up at that point, but I do realize also reading from certain texts and also what some of the eminent persons group has also written about it, that many of the very good suggestions that were made in the drafting of the ASEAN Charter were eventually rejected. And no one quite knew it was political or not.
If anybody is interested in this issue, I suggest you read the exchange between Tommy Koh and myself. It goes into great detail. I wrote 1 page in the Straits Times. He replied in an even longer piece, and I responded to him.
Thank you, Ambassador. And over to you, Ben. Any views on this question of the sense of community, views on the new presidency in Indonesia?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. I think coming from the UK, where we did leave a regional body, I think one of the major challenges was a lack of a sense of community. There were lots of reasons why the UK left the EU, immigration and politics and everything else. But I think part of it was a majority of the British public didn't feel they were part of the EU. They felt it was a very elite institution. So I think if you want to keep a regional organization going in the long term, ordinary people have to feel that there's something in it for them, so they know why their leaders are spending so much time at all these meetings. So I think it's important, but that can't necessarily come from like the Secretariat. It can't come from the Commission in the case of Europe. It has to somehow come from the ground up, which is hard. Because I always think of ASEAN as an outsider. It's more like ASEAG, right? It's actually an association of governments more than nations, and the socio-cultural bit, is really hard to do because it can't really come from the top. So how will that happen, we'll have to see. But one interesting point is, our identities as humans are often forged against others. So maybe actually this more contentious, fractious time could be an opportunity to kind of redefine the Southeast Asian identity under pressure from other outside forces. On Prabowo, I think we know what President Prabowo's style will be, very personalized. He's a tough leader. He wants to sort of impose himself. He wants to have a big personal role in foreign and security policy. I think the interesting question will be, what's the flavor of his foreign policy? Like, what's he really interested in? And I think we don't really know yet. He's spent more than 2 decades trying to become the president of Indonesia. So it'll be fascinating now he's finally there to see what really matters to him, because governing any country is so hard, as has already been said. You can only do a few things. So I think that would be the key question for me. Where does he really put his energy and focus on foreign policy? And it's still too early to say.
If, with your indulgence, because we started late, I'd like to take another round of questions. Yes, and Dylan at the back.
Thank you. My question would like to address to Ibu Mari. Ibu Mari, China and ASEAN are set to upgrade the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement again, with the new deal expected to be signed next year. And reports suggest that the upgrade will focus on the new engines of growth like digital economy and sustainability, exactly the same topics that are discussed very extensively today. At the same time, several Southeast Asian governments, including Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, are working to address the influx of Chinese cheap goods via e-commerce platforms like Temu, which directly links manufacturers to consumers in Southeast Asia and bypasses local intermediaries. And recently, the Indonesian communications minister said that we are not here to protect e-commerce. We are here to protect our SMEs. So in this context, how should ASEAN countries navigate the balance between the trade liberalization drive, which is ASEAN's favorite term, which also boosts competitiveness and consumer access to affordable goods. And at the same time, governments also need to protect domestic industries, local businesses, and local employment. And could the ongoing upgrade of the ASEAN-China FTA do something about this to achieve a better balance? Thank you.
Okay, Dylan, and I have a lady over there.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, esteemed panelists. I have a question for Ben. I thank you for putting together a very persuasive argument, and I'm inclined to agree as well that instead of avoiding choosing, we should confront some of these choices, and that goes beyond choosing in an alliance manner, US or China. I guess my question to you is, what exactly then are these choices? Could you lay out more concretely where we need to make these choices collectively as ASEAN and as individual member states? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Sharon from CNA. My question is for Ben, but thank you for everyone for your insights so far. Ben, I always appreciate your insights, especially when I listen to Chatham House's podcast. I think you shared that there's competition between the different groupings in Asia, primarily stemming from the desire to be the convening power when making decisions in different areas. So my curiosity is whether there's a particular grouping or groupings that seem to be coming up top in terms of decision making within Asia or within Southeast Asia as a whole, maybe in different areas. So, for example, in technology, security, economy, the environment, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we start with you first, Ben? Oh, okay. Then I'll start with Ibu Mari on the upgrade of the ASEAN-China FTA 3.0.
Thank you. I'm not so updated on what's the content of the upgrade, but I do think it should address, an ongoing issue when we talk about competition, or it's always like what we say, a love and hate relationship that we always have with China, in the sense that we welcome their investments and also the low-cost goods, but at the same time, we're also know that we are facing the competition, and domestically it always plays out as an issue, right? So it's always this balance, even way back when we first signed on the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So I think we need to be conscious of that. That's an ongoing issue, and that the China-ASEAN FTA, which we actually did argue for that way back in 2010. It needs to have a stronger capacity building component as well as investment. But the investments need to be really involving the local companies, not just just 100% Chinese and really just having their own industrial estate, which doesn't have multiplier effect or effect on the domestic economy, something like that, right? So I think that component should be strengthened because we want to anticipate. We don't want to have increased tensions also that could happen in our respective countries. It's already happening, actually. We already see it in the media. We already see it when we talk to our business people. And one manifestation is the so-called cheap goods, but it's really kind of low-end consumer goods, and it's not just coming through e-commerce. E-commerce is only one channel, and there it's really about how can you have a level playing field with paying the taxes and so on. But there's a lot of smuggling, what we call parallel imports, and with e-commerce there's usually like $100 limit, but maybe you have to lower the limit, perhaps. Yeah, that's one way to address it, because a lot of these are very, very, very low cost goods, but they're coming in anyway through other channels. So my answer when I get all these questions is, okay, first of all, we do have instruments, we do have trade defense instruments. Let's use them. Whether it's imports, trade remedies in the WTO is allowed, which is import surge, anti-dumping, safeguard, whatever. We should maximize that. Some of the outcries, well, why can't we do what the US does? Impose 200% tariff, impose 100% tariff. Well, you're not the US, not just because you're not a big country, but hey, guess what? The US can do that because they don't recognize China as a market economy. That's why they can do that. But we, ASEAN, we recognize China already as a market economy. So your first resort should be the instruments, right? And your second most important resort, strengthen your own domestic competitiveness. There are lots of issues with SMEs, including the high cost of doing business, blah blah blah, right? So we have to also do our homework domestically and so on. So I sympathize with you because we are actually facing this question right now. But I think the way to go is not to do a tit for tat, because they can also do tit for tat with you, right? much stronger, and you're gonna lose because for what we need, which is the green transition, the lowest cost of goods for all the energy transition, whether it's renewables, EV, is going to come from China. But we want to have more investments also. And I mean, investments that are not, perhaps this is not the right word for it, but not China dominated, only because you are going to also face other issues if you're going to export, right? So can I just have not a rebuttal, but a response to Ben's point? You can't, you have to choose sides at the end. You know what? I think we don't really have to choose sides. We just have to be smart about it. You know what's emerging on the ground is two supply chains, basically. So we choose both, in other words. We choose to manage the small garden, and we do, minimize whatever things they're concerned with. And then we have another supply chain where it doesn't matter, which is for the rest of the world and our region. But who pays for it? It's going to be a higher cost at the end, because you have to have two supply chains. I think the people who pay the most for it is actually the US consumers and the European consumers. But that's the price for security, right?
Yes, Ambassador.
I'd like to follow up on Mary's point about the even-handed approach by ASEAN to the United States and Japan. I would emphasize that there's a need to be wary of triumphalist voices calling for an Asian century, the rise of Asia, decline of the West, because what we will actually see is a resistance by the West to the power transition which is taking place. At the same time, weaker Asian states will be wary of the growing power of and influence of regional hegemons. And it's not just in Southeast Asia. Even in South Asia, you will see this happening vis-a-vis India. China's neighbors will be pushed in two directions. They will be increasingly oriented towards China economically, but moving closer to the United States and to one another as security partners. If I look at Singapore, what will be critical for Singapore is managing the partnerships with the United States and China. China will be our largest trading partner. But what is often forgotten is that the United States is the largest investor in Singapore. The United States has more invested in Singapore than in China, Japan, and South Korea combined. So this is a point that needs to be borne in mind in looking at our relationship with China and the United States, aside from security, political, and other relationships. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. On choices, obviously there are so many different choices, and I wouldn't sort of deign to tell countries what choices they should make, but I think it's about acknowledging the cost-benefit analysis. So rather than just imagining that you can have security and prosperity and all these things at the same time, there are trade-offs, and people have different views of what security and economic security might mean. So I think it's about almost doing the costings, right, and accepting that if we want this, it's going to have this impact on our business or our consumers, and is that price worth the potential upsides? I think there's been a tendency in all our countries to kind of wish away those kinds of decisions. I think it's not really effective. Just very quickly in terms of which groups are coming out, I just don't think we're necessarily going to move back to a world where there's one new kind of global organization that dominates everything. I think we're just going to be in this phase of very fluid, new things springing up. Some will disappear. Maybe in 10 years, no one will be talking about the Quad anymore, or maybe it will be the new Asian NATO. We just don't know. Even ASEAN, in its history, morphed from being kind of an informal anti-communist grouping to something much broader than that. So I think we really don't know how it's going to work. It's a very fluid and kind of uncertain time, and I think that reflects the world we're in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think this has been a really rich discussion, and one of the things that I personally wanted to pick up was Ibu Mari's idea of tending to the other garden. And really it's become very important for ASEAN. I was just joking with a friend the other day that in this geopolitical new normal, it's like you have to be everywhere all at once, kind of, chewing gum, walking, TikToking, and doing all kinds of things, because you better be at the table or you'll be on the menu, right? So that's what everyone's kind of thinking about. And I totally agree. I think one of the things that we have disregarded is the fact that ASEAN has agency. And I hope that ASEAN can collectively, on this choice about not making choices. I do agree with Ibu Mari that we have to be smart about making some of these choices. So for instance, in the supply chain on critical minerals, a colleague and I have done a paper. It's painfully obvious that the region is very far behind in terms of the moving downstream in the processes, and that China is leap years ahead of us. But can we be smart about making those choices so that eventually we can create an ASEAN-led supply chain for critical minerals, or an ASEAN-led supply chain in producing certain component parts for clean technologies in the region? I think we can, but it does take time, and it takes a lot of resources. It also takes extra energy to run faster and be nimbler and more flexible than everyone else to be able to do this. And so with the ASEAN champion hat on me, I'm not yet prepared to declare doom on this organization, but to say that there's a lot of work ahead of us. And with that, I want to thank our esteemed panelists. Please join me in thanking them for their thoughts.